justice. We do, no, that's fine. We do policy work, direct representation, provide general technical assistance. Really, it's an interdisciplinary practice, kind of at the intersection of civil rights and environmental law. We partner and represent communities in a variety of matters involving racial and economic disparities and kind of the distribution of polluting sources. We also are regularly making sure communities are involved in public participation processes and basically in any decisions affecting their lives. The clinic was started by Marian Engelman Lotto, who's a longtime civil rights lawyer and environmental justice attorney. She's now with the Biden administration, which we're very excited about. And she brought her practice to Vermont Law School in 2019, and we're continuing under Ardini Morakan. A little about me. And I've been working at the environments at the law school for the last 8 years. And I'll leave it there. I mean, we work on a variety of matters, and I'll share a little bit more later today. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. We did lose you for a little bit there. So if you need to, if you're finding you're getting a little bit of a lag, feel free to keep, you can turn off your video. That might help.
Okay, sorry about that. I'll check my connection. Thanks.
No problem. Seema, you're next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Seema Kakade, and I direct a clinic similar to what Rachel described at the University of Maryland instead of at Vermont, which is where Rachel is. So my clinic also we have about 10 students every year that situate themselves in our clinic to focus on environmental justice matters in the Maryland area and greater DMV area. We do a whole variety of stuff. We do a lot in zoning. We do a lot in NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. We do a lot on administrative comments and helping community groups and small nonprofit organizations navigate through the administrative comment process for permits. We do also focus on a whole variety of issues related to food and urban agriculture. So we really run the gamut. We are not specific on a particular issue, but really try to look at the variety of issues that a particular community might be facing. We also tend to help out more established nonprofit organizations, whether they are in the civil rights space or environmental space, when they are looking to do more environmental justice work and don't always have the capacity to do so. My clinic will often co-counsel with an established nonprofit group to help them out on their capacity. So we have about 50% where we work directly with communities on our own, and the other half is really spent in a co-counsel or a relationship with an established nonprofit to deal with some environmental justice issues that might be more long-standing or that just might need more attorneys assigned. So that's my clinic.
Thanks, Seema. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. My name is Scott Edwards, and I actually wear a lot of different hats for a lot of different organizations right now. I'm on the panel as working alongside with a group called Richman Law Group, which has been focused on largely on food systems, but brings a lot of consumer protection type actions on behalf of individuals and organizations across the country. And so I've engaged with Richman Law Group for the last few years on a number of different cases in DC and California around protecting consumers from unethical practices and the impacts that they're having on communities. On the more formal environmental justice front, I am consulting and working alongside folks in a new program that's starting up called One Rural, that's focusing on rural environmental justice issues, and again, heavily on industrial ag systems because of the impact on rural communities, but also looking at manufacturing and a lot of the other impacts on rural communities that are somewhat being ignored by a lot of folks and helping create this sort of rural-urban divide and rural communities being left out of a lot of dialogues that are going on around the country politically and otherwise. So we're focusing a lot on rural issues with one rule. But over my career, I've focused mostly on environmental law. I've worked for a lot of, not a lot, over the 20 some odd years I've been practicing, worked basically with two big nonprofit organizations that focus a lot on traditional environmental approaches, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, those types of cases. But, you know, I've always found that it's really hard for me as a practitioner to separate environmental law from environmental justice because of citing issues and the fact that we're purposely putting pollution causing industries in environmental justice communities. In fact, my first case ever that I took, or big case I ever took on was over 21 years ago down on the island of Vieques that was being bombed by the Navy since the 1940s. And it was a really good exposure for me into environmental law because in addition to bringing classical environmental legal actions, we also were bringing civil rights actions because of the impacts that the Navy was having on local communities down there. And so right off the from the beginning, environmental approaches and environmental justice approaches go hand in hand. And I've tried to embrace that approach throughout my career. Again, currently in my current positions, there's lots of ways in which I engage with communities on shared legal actions, but also a lot of work around policy, grassroots organizing, community building, all the interaction and outreach that needs to happen in order to have effective campaigns.
Awesome. Thank you all. So let's get into kind of, for the audience, maybe kind of demystifying a little bit about, you know, what pro bono legal services are. We definitely know that they can offer impacted communities an accessible, winning solution to a lot of legal battles. And considering that many communities with EJ issues are often under-resourced or disenfranchised, or, you know, take whatever adjective you want to use to say that they've been crapped on for decades and centuries in some cases. How do communities come in to accessing pro bono legal services through each of your different avenues? So I'll start off with Scott, and we'll do 2 minutes.
Yeah, it's a really important question. We are live in a country of laws. As a matter of fact, when I started my career, I was a teacher in underserved communities doing parole and chancellor suspension programs for 12 years in New York City. And this was back in the 80s and into the 90s. And I went to law school because I recognized that law is such an important tool in this country to achieve social justice or any kind of justice. So law is critical. It's a pivotal part. It is also hugely resource intensive to bring cases, and it costs a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of people power to bring litigation. And so pro bono counsel is critical to all of the fights, including the environmental justice fight. One of my biggest resources, and Seema and Rachel can speak to this, is over the years has been through law school clinics, and they've been. I've worked with Maryland in the past when Jane was the director, certainly up at Columbia, Widener, Lewis and Clark. I found over the years that I've practiced and need help bringing cases, both as a client, as a nonprofit, but as a co-counsel, because we need help given the industries we're often up against. That law school clinics have played a critical role in representing people. There's certainly the nonprofit sector, right, that has lawyers. Most of the big nonprofits certainly have a good law team and very good lawyers who are willing to bring cases on behalf of clients and communities. They have their own agenda, nonprofits. You have to make sure your goal, your interests are very much aligned with what the nonprofit's interests are. And I was going to talk a little bit about that later, but certainly the nonprofit community is a good resource for folks looking to bring actions. And then there's the more traditional law firm pro bono practice area that folks should be tapping into. And I've had very mixed experiences working with law firms on pro bono. You have to do your homework and your research to figure out what their practice areas are, what their criteria are, and make sure, again, your interests are aligned. it's a struggle looking for legal resources. And again, I've done it as a member of a nonprofit. It's hard to do given the resources that it takes to bring litigation, but there's help out there. So you have to keep digging and looking and networking and not being afraid to really get in there and be aggressive and pitch your case to a whole group of folks.
Thanks, Scott. Seema and then Rachel to kind of go into that university approach. And what I'm trying to get into with this question is how does a community member, how do they hear about you? How do they get in touch? How do they access, the services that you have?
So I will say first that for anyone listening today, if you have needs, call me, email me. That is honestly the way I get inquiries, is people just find me through various channels. It's through events like this that I am speaking at all the time to get the word out that we exist. University of Maryland in a clinic program also has other clinics in other disciplines. We have a community economic development clinic. We have a public health law clinic. We have a consumer protection clinic. And so sometimes inquiries come into our broader clinical program from a community because it doesn't always squarely fit environmental or squarely fit community economic development. And we get referrals and inquiries coming into one of the other clinics. And all of my colleagues are also out there speaking and at the Maryland State Legislature and all kinds of places where they hear from a community member that a community might have an individual might have a specific issue in tax or criminal defense. And then lo and behold, turns out they live in an area where there's also an ongoing environmental issue. And so I get referrals from a variety of areas within our clinical program. I will also say too, that the overall environmental law clinics, there are about 40 to 45 in the country that focus on environmental issues broadly. Not all of them focus on environmental justice, but we refer things to each other. So the colleagues that are in the area at Georgetown, at University of Virginia, at Columbia, at Delaware, as Scott mentioned, we sometimes don't have capacity to take things that we're hearing from people, and we'll call up one of our neighboring clinics to say, do you have space? So I'm getting calls a lot from, more than I can really handle, and people are contacting me and finding me through lots of different avenues.
Thanks. Rachel?
Yeah, I second everything that Seema said. I think the Environmental Law Clinic Network is a really useful tool that students can tap into, or not students can tap into and work there, obviously, but for community clients that need representation. And also for a lot of the reasons that Scott said, the law clinics are often, their mission is to provide pro bono legal services and to teach the students. And there's not always, clinics have different specialties, but there's not an agenda. It's more of a legal services trade. And oftentimes, along with what Seema said, we will partner with other lawyers that have expertise. I saw Chris had a question, obviously in the chat about a lack of maybe lawyer desert in Virginia, but like clinics like ours actually do representation across the country, and we'll work with lawyers that are more local to make sure that our attorneys who aren't licensed in that state can participate. And sometimes we're just providing technical assistance or kind of support and guidance. So if there's a lawyer in your state that has questions about how to file a civil rights complaint, for example, we'll take a call and be happy to have a consultation with kind of thinking through what to expect and provide some support that way. So I definitely think that there are a large network of lawyers doing the work, but as Seema said, there's also a huge capacity concern. And just to explain a little bit more about the clinic model, we work year round on cases. As Seema said, we have students each semester. Our clinic has about 10 to 15 students, and we have 3 semesters in the year. And we try to recheck our kind of clinic docket each, about 3 times a year, just to make sure that we're setting our docket for the semester. So we're doing the fall planning now, and we'll be starting again in the fall. Obviously, a lot of legal matters will happen over several years. So we have some community clients that we've worked with. For instance, Yen and I actually work on a case in Uniontown, Alabama, and we've worked on that case for years, even before Marion was at Vermont Law School. So I guess just practically speaking, I would definitely reach out to the people on this call, and we can try to at least have an initial consultation about what your needs are and try to plug you in and get you connected to resources. And, in addition to legal resources or technical assistance, like what we do, there's also, we can, oftentimes communities need like help with a communications campaign, or might need, support with community organizing. And there's a lot of other organizations that can help with those aspects of the case too. So yeah, I'll leave it there, but yeah, email anyone on this panel.
Thanks. And yeah, I definitely want to point and flag that there are email addresses in the chat, so copy those down. We can also share them, through the Google platform, or you can contact us at CEEJH and we can put you in contact with any of these folks. Leah, anything to add there about the EIP model?
Well, we are the only nonprofit that's not a clinic on the panel. So yeah, but it is similar, I think, in that, we get folks come to us and with requests. We do work with clinics as well, including Seema, and sometimes we share referrals back and forth. So Seema will get somebody and she'll ask whether we can help.
Say it again.
Vice versa. And I guess just one thing I would add, though, is that, I think by virtue of the fact that we have a pretty heavy concentration in a small geographic area, Baltimore City, one of the things that I've found has been effective is creating actual relationships with, like, ongoing relationships with communities that are overburdened and that are subject to pollution from multiple sources. Sometimes communities, I think, they recognize something happens and they don't recognize that there's a legal opportunity. I'll give an example. One community that we work with, I've gotten drawn into a stakeholder process of a remediation of a particular site. And we all on this email list of this group got an email about a permit change. The polluter wanted to make a permit change, and I was able to sort of reach out to the community leaders and say, hey, we can oppose this if you want. We don't have to. And so we worked on that together. But I think, that can be valuable, creating, relationships with community leaders, creating relationships with organizers who work in particular communities, so that if something comes up, they can kind of come to you and say, like, oh, this is an opportunity to do something.
Excellent. Awesome. I really want to dig into here, what really makes this a winning combination for communities. And I've mentioned, the disenfranchisement and under-resourced, but maybe through describing some success stories or even some challenges in working with communities in this way, can you show how this pro bono model really is better than more traditional or alternatives? So I'll start with Seema.
So yes, I'll share some success stories, and I'll say there are some that maybe some might view as being small, some might view as being medium, and some might view as being big, right? And I sometimes tend to think that when we talk about successes, we're only focused on big, right? Like there's some huge change that happened, there's some huge court case that gave us a big win, right? I actually think that most of the EJ work in the pro bono legal space are what might be unrecognized, and we're not really focused on it because they're everyday little wins, right? I consider it to be a win when I'm able to really have my clinic identify for a community that what they really need is actually not a legal solution at the moment. It might eventually get there, but we really need them to have a technical expert that can really digest some of their issues. And I'll put them in touch with Jan Michael or Jacoby Wilson from our School of Public Health, or Lori Edwards from our School of Community Nursing, or someone from atmospheric science or soil science within the university. I make it my job to have connections with other departments that can provide really amazing scientific and technical expertise. To me, that's a win, right? Or if we do a community legal education webinar like we did last year on how communities can write an effective comment as part of the NEPA process. And we focused on road and rail in that webinar. And we had 75 people join. To me, that's a win, right? When I have a community group who we eventually on this day after attended that in NEPA legal education webinar and then specifically sought out direct legal representation for us to help read a very lengthy NEPA document that was coming their way that they did not know how they were going to get through it and understand it. And my students spent months on weekly calls with them discussing each section of that NEPA document with them, right? And then that community group sent my students a wonderful box of chocolates in the mail at the end of the semester. Like, to me, that's a win, right? That's a success because we're making connections and we're helping in what might be considered small, but really meaningful ways.
Absolutely. Rachel, why don't you go next?
Yeah, I have a couple examples, and I was also kind of reflecting on what Seema was saying there too, because the examples I wanted to share is one, we did have a recent, what I would call like a big win, though there's a lot of factors that led to that I'll talk about. But then there's also the kind of ongoing work, and then also we've had some really like disturbing losses and decisions from agencies that we have to really confront and kind of manage expectations. When you're doing EJ work, it is really difficult to quote win under the law because of all the limitations, which I can I'll talk about, I'm sure. But one recent case that we were involved in is in St. Croix in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and actually Yen was also involved in this one because the community had a lot of questions about air quality monitoring around an oil refinery that was actually at one point, I think, one of the world's largest oil refineries that was shut down for 10 years because of oil spills and a lot of air pollution. And the Trump, in its final days, had issued an air permit to allow the oil refinery to start operating again without, there was not adequate public notice, there was no language access. People didn't have an opportunity to weigh in and were shocked when the refinery started. I don't even think the state agency knew that the refinery was going to start the day it did. And then there were just, odors and flares, and it was pretty distressing for the community. So we worked in coalition with a number of other lawyers to appeal the air permit. And one of the reasons I want to bring out this case is because I think this model of like working with a team of lawyers with a variety of expertise actually worked really well in this case. So for instance, we worked, our clinic raised the environmental justice concerns. So, EPA had issued the permit in St. Croix and had failed to do an environmental justice analysis as required under the EJ executive order. And in the Environmental Appeals Board, there actually are some good cases about the agency's EJ analysis and like what needs to be in that kind of document. So we just focused on those arguments. Meanwhile, the lawyers at the Natural Resource Defense Council did the Clean Air Act arguments, and then we had another set of lawyers doing the endangered species arguments. And that allowed all the organizations to kind of bring their expertise without stretching any of the organizations thin. It also allowed resource sharing. So our clinic didn't have to front the fees, but the organizations with more funding could do that. I wanted to call that out because I thought that was a really great partnership. Another reason why I think that case was successful, because ultimately EPA did withdraw the air permit and actually had to shut down the refinery because it caught fire. I want to say that it was excellent lawyering, which there was a lot of advocacy, but it also caught fire. And that was a really, really startling incident that led to an emergency order to shut down the refinery. But all of the legal arguments and strategy and conversations with EPA were all community led. So the lawyers really stepped back and made sure that we were we had our role in bringing the claims and helping shape the legal arguments. And then the community was out front in discussions with the agency, in doing town halls and talking to their, coming up with solutions. The community even did a door-to-door community survey to assess the impacts, and that data was given to EPA and was a great example of kind of community-driven, information and data collection. So those are just some reasons why I think that case was also successful. One more point on this one was there was a big effort to get the press get involved. I think is something that, just looking. Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Ann? Am I getting cut off?
You are getting a little bit choppy there.
Let me try just audio, see if that makes a difference. The last thing I just wanted to say about that case is that there was an effort to get some of the media involved. And I think a lot of times, when we're thinking about legal strategies and trying to get solutions, there needs to be a communication strategy involved as well, because it was really it was Reuters and the Washington Post and some other press that actually brought some of the media attention. And I know that can be very difficult. And I'll just share another example of a place where I think needs a lot more attention and focus, but has not had that. And that's a case that Yen and I work on in Uniontown, Alabama. And this is a great example of a university partnership where Yen's program provides actual air monitors on the ground so we can assess impacts from air pollution. But the landfill in Uniontown was the recipient of the 4 million tons of coal ash that was cleaned up after the Kingston coal ash spill in Tennessee. And as a result, the community has had serious harms. And what's really disturbing about this example is that it was Marian Engelman Lotto's case when she was at Yale, and also working with Earth Justice, which is another organization that does great community partnerships. And they brought several civil rights complaints that were dismissed by EPA, and I think it was 2018. And even the US Commission on Civil Rights issued a report and did an investigation that found that EPA's dismissal was like totally unwarranted. But there's been no resolution there. So they, that community had really excellent advocates, filed a civil rights complaint, used the process as it's supposed to, and it still failed them. So I just want to share that as an example of kind of ongoing work. And even with our best efforts, without systemic changes, it can be hard to get legal victories. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to say, I think, but.
No, yeah, thank you, Rachel. I think there is a lot more to say there, but I think we'll return to that point in one of the next questions. We'll go Leah and then Scott.
Well, I actually agree with everything that Seema and Rachel also said, especially in terms of victories not being. I think sort of the most meaningful victories are not necessarily sort of big case wins, or at least that's not been the case in my experience. And it's sort of, I would say, I think it's, it's things that feel like they actually empower a community and, make them feel like they have control over what is happening in their neighborhood. I'll give an example. There is a community in Baltimore, highly industrialized, very overburdened community. A couple of years ago, there was a permit granted to build the country's largest trash incinerator in the community. There was already a trash incinerator 4 miles away, but they felt they needed to, apparently. And so we worked with the local community to challenge the air quality permit. We ultimately identified a legal theory that the air permit had expired due to the company's failure to construct on a required schedule under the Clean Air Act. We worked with the community to press the state agency for a determination that the air permit had expired. It ended up being almost a year-long campaign. After developing all the facts and developing the legal arguments. We wrote letters, the community made videos, and they staged a protest and actually got arrested at the agency offices. We ended up actually formally representing them and sending what's called a notice of intent that basically previews that you're about to file a complaint in court, because we would have eventually done that but the agency ultimately made the decision to withdraw the permit, so we did not actually have to take legal action, but we were prepared to litigate. And then we followed it through with, there was a separate agency that had sort of separate permitting authority, and we were able to work with the community to ensure that agency recognized the decision of the Maryland Department of the Environment, and also recognized that the permit had expired.
Thanks, Leah. And that's exactly where I want to go next, but I want to hear from you, Scott, successes.
Yeah, well, I want to reiterate what a lot of my colleagues here have said. You know, success for me is not measured by whether I win or lose a lawsuit. It's by whether the community gets what it needs at the end of the campaign. And I always look at lawsuits as a tactic, and it's only one tactic. And sometimes it's an important tactic, and sometimes it's not such an important tactic. You should be bringing help to communities by launching and helping them launch, and supporting their ongoing efforts around a whole series of legal maneuvers and communications work and outreach and policy making and lobbying and on and on and on. And, you know, sometimes, you know, the lawsuits are very important. And, you know, I've been disinvited from law school several times for saying, and sometimes lawyers aren't so important in these things, right? They are a very small part. You are there to support a community. This lawsuit's not about you, it's about the community. And you can be a bit player or you can be a big player, but whatever you are, you're there to support the community. And, you know, I was lucky enough to learn that lesson right off the bat in my legal career, again, going back to the Navy on the islands, right? And suing the United States Navy, being told by everybody that I will lose that case no matter what I do, that the courts, the federal courts down in Puerto Rico are pro-Navy, they're very political. And I learned that lesson when I walked into federal court for the first hearing, and there was a portrait of the judge in his Navy Reserve uniform up behind his chair. And he proceeded for the next 3 years of litigation to deny me every single motion I ever made, threatened to put me in jail, threatened to issue a gag order. I couldn't get anywhere with this judge, but I worked very closely with the community on lobbying, and they were engaged in civil disobedience, and we're doing tons of communications work. And so I was losing every legal battle I had to begin with, and throughout the litigation, but I was helping create the space, and the litigation was helping create the space and forcing a dialogue, a difficult dialogue about what the Navy was doing on the island. And, you know, 3 years into that litigation, the Navy packed up and left, and now that bombing range is the largest nature reserve in the Caribbean. And so I lost the case. The people won their campaign and got to where they needed to be. I played a small role in that, but it was a role of getting beaten up by a judge on a weekly basis for 3 years, right? And so it was a humbling experience, but it was an important lesson for me, and I've embraced that throughout my career. None of these things are about me as a lawyer, about winning or losing a case. This is about helping communities solve their problems. I think more recently, I'll give you an example of I think a good success, and it's not in the DMV, but it's in the Chesapeake watershed up in Pennsylvania. I worked with organizers from the socially responsible agriculture project, SRAP, in passing, and this again, not going into court, but as a lawyer doing policy work and helping with ordinance drafting and getting good, because ultimately we need good policy to solve these problems, right? Our policymakers need to implement good policies. And so I worked in a community that was just sick and tired of industrial ag systems, CAFOs coming in, helped them draft a local ordinance which effectively banned any more CAFOs coming into their township. And we did it with the knowledge that Pennsylvania has a law called ACRE, which preempts local communities from controlling any local agricultural practices. So this ordinance that I helped them pass was with the knowledge that they would likely get sued by the state attorney general to overturn it under a preemption argument that you're not allowed to control local ag. But I drafted that ordinance, and we worked with the community with the knowledge that they would get sued, because I think we thought ACRE, and still think that ACRE is unconstitutional, and it divests local communities of what they should have, which is local control over their communities. That was passed 4 years ago, and it still stands, and there are no more CAFOs in the community, and the attorney general has declined to sue them over it. If they ever do get sued, we'll be going to court to try to overturn ACRE, and then that will impact the entire state and all the communities who wish to control industrial ag systems and the growth. So the fact that that ordinance was passed, and the fact that the AG hasn't overturned it in 4 years, I think was a big success for that community. And it empowered other communities in Pennsylvania to pass similar ordinances to cut CAFOs out of their neighborhoods. And those ordinances still stand today too. So it's an example of policy work that's critical for lawyers to do.
Thanks a lot, Scott. And yeah, so all of you, I think, touched on this issue that it's hard to win under the law. In Virgin Islands, there was a fire. It wasn't necessarily the efforts, the direct. I mean, you can draw the line between the efforts and then the final result, but the little wins are kind of what makes it. Showing up and being there and being consistent and putting pressure is what moves the needle. And one thing that I would really like for you all to kind of expand on are what are the systemic changes that need to happen in the legal system writ large, so that you don't always, or not that you always have to win on a technicality, but even with Energy Answers, the permit expired, the company kind of had money problems, right, for getting that work started. So it's really helpful to have you all on the ground and working through it. But what would you like to see as a systemic kind of shift to make the work that you're doing easier, if not obsolete? That's a big question. We don't have to take it to that end, but please go ahead, Leah.
So I guess, how could the laws be better, right? Like, how could the laws be better and help us win more? I think there are a lot of, over the course of my work, I feel like I've identified a lot of gaps and a lot of ways in which specific laws could be better. I guess, my immediate default is to something that, we've talked a lot as part of sort of a growing coalition in Maryland, is the idea of, in the first place, taking a look at whether overburdened communities need more pollution sources in the first place, and whether there should be enhanced review of new pollution sources located in already overburdened communities. And we've also started talking about whether, tied to that, could be a requirement for good kinds of economic development in the same community. So on the one hand, paying more attention to enhancing review of proposals to put new pollution sources in already overburdened communities, but at the same time creating incentives for good jobs and for good development in those communities. I do think that kind of thing would make the work a lot easier, because you would have, for example, the Energy Answers incinerator. We were able to get it ultimately. The project was ultimately stopped, but it was 6 years after it was initially permitted, and it was permitted despite the fact that it actually didn't comply with a state law in Maryland, and the company just was able to get around it at the time. So I think, a little additional review and additional sort of scrutiny of big new, of health harming pollution sources in those kinds of communities would certainly be helpful to this kind of work.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, and again, sorry for my internet connection, but I'll just share, for folks that aren't following, there are some exciting laws at the federal level that are currently before Congress, the EJ for All Act, and others, and those actually are, intended to fix some issues that the Supreme Court introduced into civil rights enforcement with the Alexander v. Sandoval case, which prevents communities from bringing their cases directly to court. So that is one discrete legal change that I think would have a big impact to improve civil rights enforcement. And also, as I think maybe I was alluding to earlier, the EJ executive order, which requires federal agencies to actually consider disproportionate impacts of their decisions, which happens maybe very rarely. To actually make some of that enforceable, so that you could actually challenge an agency decision for failing to do that. I also think a systemic change is along the lines of what you were saying, Leah. We are seeing some really exciting stuff at the state and local level with zoning ordinances. Our clinic does some work in Newark, New Jersey with the Ironbound community that has been fighting a waste incinerator since it was built in the 80s and 90s. And just, we have thrown every legal challenge we can at it. We've sued them under the Clean Air Act, we've appealed permits, and it's still there, and it's still burning trash, and it's still hurting people. And so the community, is really focusing on state laws. So last year, New Jersey passed a cumulative impacts law that will prevent, new major sources of pollution in overburdened communities, and prevent the renewal of certain air permits. So that was kind of an example where, as along the lines of what Scott said, the lawyers are getting really beat up over there, and we're not being able to, we're not seeing the impacts from that litigation, but it's spurring a conversation and a policy shift that has, created a lot of momentum. I'll also share, just from talking to those advocates in New Jersey, the protests last summer with George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement made a big difference in the political landscape. So I think that's something that I don't want to lose sight of in that example of the state law. Obviously, it will depend how the law is implemented, and that's something that we'll be keeping an eye on, and how the state and other states do that work. And I'll also just make a plug that our clinic is working on a website that will share state environmental justice laws and policy. So it's some research that we've been doing with partners for a while to kind of collect that information and put it in one place. So we'll definitely, I'll make sure to share that information with your networks, and so you can get that out, and hopefully that could be a useful resource for what local communities could do at their state. So
Awesome. Thanks, Rachel. I'll go to Seema and then Scott.
Oh boy, this is a big question. I think there's so much that needs to be done on a systematic level. And I think a lot of it is, outside even the legal realm, and things that have been discussed at this symposium, like funding for major infrastructure, right? I mean, you've got so many issues with respect to funding. I would love to see massive amounts of funding for pro bono legal services, and what I would call pro bono wraparound services, which are really all of the kinds of services we've been talking about here for communities. Because in my view, there will always be power imbalances. And I think that is where we need to really make sure that communities are empowered. And the only way I really think to do that is, to make sure that there are the resources to allow for that power to be shifted. And really empowering that community means funding them. It means funding the areas around them through community economic development, like Leah's talking about. It's funding green space around them. It's funding food sources around them. It's funding better sewage piping, so Leah's not having to take individual sewage backup cases, right? It's really shifting the community in a very positive direction. And so to me, a lot of that is based on funding and wraparound services to support those communities, which the law and legal services is one part of all of that. And so I would really love to see more requirements on attorneys to be taking pro bono legal cases. I would love to see more work done in the legal bar on making sure that attorneys can take cases and understand really if they're conflicted out or not. Because a lot of pro bono lawyers will say, I can't take that case because it might present a conflict later on, or it might not, or I'm not sure if it will. So I think there's a lot we can do within the legal bar, because I do think there actually are quite a few attorneys that want to do this work and either don't know how, worried about conflicts, worried about perceptions. There's a lot of that going on. So I think that there are changes happening. The American Bar Association section on environment and energy and natural resources is moving it much more in this direction. Providing services actually to lawyers who want to get into this space more and be able to provide services. So that's the kind of thing I would hope would happen. Jan, is not necessarily thinking about how do we solve problems where lawyers aren't needed. Unfortunately, I don't think that that's going to happen anytime soon, but I actually think that there are more lawyers that want to and can and should get involved.
Awesome. Thank you. Scott, bring us home on this question.
Well, a new government would be good, but short of that, You know, what I've seen increasingly through my years of practice, and this goes to the point that Rachel made around Sandoval, right, and the Supreme Court decision on that case, which did tremendous amount of damage to bringing environmental justice claims in this country. But what I've been witnessing, and everything that everybody was talking about, funding is critical, right, to overcome because of the resource intensive, how intensive litigation is. But what I've been seeing over my years of practice is an increasing effort by the courts to keep plaintiffs they don't like out of the court, and that's what the Scalia decision in Sandoval 20 years ago did, right? It kept environmental justice plaintiffs out of the court by stripping away a private cause of action. I think one of Congress's most enlightened moments was, again, coming as an environmental practitioner, mostly under federal environmental statutes, is including citizen suit provisions and all those wonderful 1970s laws that they passed: Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Endangered Species Act. But for empowering citizens to bring their own cases, we would not have made a fraction of the progress we've made around clean water and clean air in this country, and we still have lots to go. But there have been critical victories in those areas because of citizen suit provisions and allowing people into court. Today, I'm seeing, the Scalia decision, which strips away private causes of action for civil rights, for environmental justice cases. I'm seeing increasingly harsh decisions around standing, even in environmental cases, right? The DC Circuit's becoming a nightmare to bring cases because they're looking for every excuse they can to say that people aren't harmed enough, or the harm's not imminent enough, and at a minimum, we should be embracing a system in which everybody gets to have their case heard in court. You shouldn't have to, wheel in a physically injured client in order to get your case heard before a judge. But these courts are ramping up the standards around standing and keeping us from even getting our cases heard often these days. We're getting dismissed left and right. So I think that needs to shift. We need to, if we want to use the courts as a system, as a mechanism, as a tactic for change, people have to have their day in court. And I really see a conscious effort by federal and state courts. States have always been tough, but by federal courts across this country cannot not give folks their day in court. And we need to address that.
Awesome. Lots of knowledge being shared here. Rachel, thanks for dropping the name of that case into the chat, so we can kind of continue.
Depressing
learning.
read, but providing it. Yeah.
Yeah, we can read it through clenched fists and teeth. But thank you very much for sharing all of this information. We've got about 4 minutes before we switch it over to audience Q&A, before we wrap up at 12:30. So just as kind of last words, advice for community members in need of help right now. I know you already shared your contact information in the chat, and if for anyone who joined in late, I'll make sure that contact information is available throughout the rest of the day and afterward. But any final last words? We'll go Leah, Seema, Rachel, Scott.
I guess just, reach out early as soon as you can. You don't want to miss opportunities. It's always terrible when we have folks reach out to us and we're like, if this had been 2 weeks ago, we could have done this, but it's too late. And it makes it easier for the attorneys. So one of the things that's pretty difficult about being a nonprofit attorney, or just any attorney, I think it's not limited to nonprofits, but we tend to have so much on our docket at this particular point in time that if the opportunity for the actual work is 2 or 3 months away, it makes it a lot easier to build it into our schedules as opposed to if it needs to be done tomorrow. So just reach out as soon as you can if you're concerned and you think you need to talk to a lawyer.
Thanks, Leah. Let's go to Seema.
Thanks. I will say that if you are an attorney that wants to help, call one of us. If you are a community member that thinks you might need help, I couldn't agree with Leah more. It does not hurt to send an email or call one of us, and we can help you. Either we can help you directly, or we can work with the network that we have in the DMV in particular to get you placed with somebody who can help. Okay, because there's certainly several groups. Okay, if you are a student and are interested, right? We've got several people who are teachers on this call. Contact us. There might be opportunities to work in the summer or over winter break, that kind of thing. If you are a technical expert of any kind, economics, mapping, health, science, engineering, urban planning, right? The list can go on and on and on. And you want to help with any of the legal work that any of us are doing, please call us. We can very likely use you, or at least put you in contact. Okay. If you are a person that needs help outside the DMV area, also contact one of us, because we may know somebody, right? EIP, Leah's group, has offices elsewhere. Rachel and I are connected to clinics in multiple other universities in multiple other locations. So we might be able to connect you. Okay. And so I would say call us, email us, and particularly I am open I will try to respond to you within 48 hours. That is what I usually try to do. Unfortunately, I do need to drop off a little bit early today, Jan, but I wanted to make sure that people that want to contact me, you can easily Google my name and find me. You also can see my email address in the chat. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Seema. Rachel, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to second what Leah said. I think as soon as you are concerned about a situation, I think it's great to talk to a lawyer as soon as possible, just to try to understand what your rights are and what you're entitled to. Because a lot of times we're contacted, it may be too late to bring a lawsuit, or the harm has kind of already been done. So the sooner you can reach out, if you suspect that something's coming on, the more that, even if you don't want to bring a lawsuit or be represented by a lawyer, you could at least get some advice about, how to move forward. The other thing, just a very practical thing, is to just write everything down, take pictures, take videos. Unfortunately, we have seen time and time again that communities will describe impacts that have happened to them. And will, maybe not be believed or discounted. And so I do think it's really helpful to make sure that if you are confronting, if there's pollution in your community, or you're feeling harmed, or you feel like you have symptoms from something, to document that as much as you can contemporaneously, and that can hopefully maybe support a case down the road. I'll also just mention there is a 180-day statute of limitations for civil rights complaints, which means that you need to file your complaint with the federal agency within 180 days of the action. So just keeping that in mind, some laws give you many years to bring a case, and you may have other options, but just want to underscore the importance of reaching out to someone as soon as you can. So.
Thank you so much for that, Rachel. Scott, go ahead.
Yeah, so everybody's given really good advice about how to find and how to begin the process of finding legal counsel for their issues. And so I want to just touch a little bit on some advice about working with lawyers once you find them, or even a little bit before you find them. As community members, these are your fights, right? And it is critical. I've seen this happen before, where I've seen lawyers not perfectly aligned with community needs. And so I think going into seeking legal representation and during legal representation, make sure that you're very upfront about where you want to go. What's your remedy? What do you want to get at the end of the day? It's a critical question that everybody should be asking themselves. And you as a client need to remember that lawyers work for you. They are there to serve your needs. And so if you find legal representation, don't be afraid to be very forceful about what you expect at the end of the day to get out of this. And the best way to avoid those conflicts is to take care of that very much up front before you ever sign a retainer, that you have that sit down, that lawyer and these folks on his phone do this and know this, that that they know your community well. You've had these discussions, you've met with them face to face if possible, you've talked this all through, and that you're all on the same page, and that you all respect each other, and that everybody wants to end up in the same place to the extent that that's possible.
Absolutely. Bye, Seema. Thanks. Thank you so much, Scott. That's a really great note to end on. So right now, I am looking through the chat here on Zoom. Rami, if you can bring over any questions from Huva, but just here's maybe an easy one. Are any of you in networks with or aware of resources in California's Bay Area?
I think Seema had responded to that and said that she can, but I think, again, I think you could email all of us because we're probably all in contact with some folks. We are a national environmental organization, but we don't do, I think we've had like maybe one case in California, so we don't tend to do that much. There is an Earth Justice office in California also.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Yeah, I'll make a plug for Earth Justice too. We partner with them a lot. They have a community partnerships program that's specifically devoted to community representation, and they have lawyers in the Bay Area and across the country that are doing excellent work. So I would definitely recommend the Earth Justice office. I think there may even be a lawyer on this call from Earth Justice, but if you want to put info in the chat. There's also a clinic out there, the Golden Gate Clinic, which has been doing environmental justice work for many years, if you want to talk to a law clinic.
Excellent. Thank you. And there was a comment in the, oh, here we go. Elisa Torres says, can you speak about mediation, not meditation, mediation as another option for conflict resolution in environmental justice cases?
I mean, I could jump in a little bit on that one. This is Scott. So you will often go to court and judges will force you into mediation. I mean, it is not atypical to force the parties to sit down and have a discussion and see if you can work cases out. I have certainly in environmental and environmental justice cases, I can't think of a mediation that ended up in a place where the client's needs were met. And so it's been successful. We usually ended up going to litigation on it. In some of the consumer cases that I've been involved in around consumer protection, mediation has been successful. So it's an option. But again, it's mediation is one of those places which touches on that point I just made before, is because I've been a client in mediation, I've also been a lawyer in mediation. And as a client in mediation, you have to be very, very sure that your needs are being met, because mediation is about giving up something, right? Everybody's going to give up something, and you have to make sure as a client in mediation that you're not giving up what ultimately you need to get out of the litigation. So be very careful about mediation, but it's an effective tool. And like I said, a lot of judges will force it on you anyway, so you'll have to have that discussion.
Thanks, Scott. Anything to add, Leah or Rachel?
I've never been involved in mediation.
I'll just share that actually, I think a lot more cases resolve through informal, not necessarily a formal mediation, but a lot more cases involve informal negotiation than I think people think. And, you know, even students in law school think that they're going to be like deposing witnesses and appearing before a judge all the time. And, you know, for example, in our New Jersey cases, we spend a lot of time negotiating with the state where I'm actually, you know, to the point where I know the enforcement people there, and we are talking regularly. So I do think there's a lot of informal conflict resolution that happens. And I completely agree with what you said, Scott. It's super important to understand what your goals are and what you're willing to settle for, or what you're willing to, what those resolutions might mean down the road. So really clear, regular and direct communication with your lawyer in those situations is super important.
Thanks, Rachel. There's I think like a technical comment by Jose Almanzar, and who gives a recommendation for private attorneys who want to do pro bono work but are concerned about conflicts. They can structure their engagement letter to be on a per project basis that gives you an out to recuse in future in case of conflict. I don't know exactly what that's all about, but is there anything more to say on that? What are we, I guess my question here is what is the perceived conflict or the potential conflicts?
Hi, it's Jose Almanzar. So I represent an EJ organization, and there was a concern about me helping them on some board governance and other projects. And the EJ kind of, their position is sometimes conflicted with some of my firm's clients. So, I wanted to help them, but I did not want to, commit myself to then either having to choose between the client or, my firm's corporate clients. So this is just kind of a general advice because Seema had spoken about potential conflict issues and private attorneys possibly not wanting to get involved for potential conflict issues. So this was just kind of an advice that would allow attorneys to be able to, in a sense, have it both ways and then reserve any conflict issues to deal with it in the future if if people are eager to help out but are maybe have some concerns.
Got it. Thanks for that. We've got 1 minute left, and I've got just a really quick question that hopefully is a quick question. So it's pro bono legal services, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. So what's going on here? How, Leah, you mentioned funding, more funding for pro bono programs. Where does that funding come from and where does it go?
I think for most of us, it's grant funding. I think that's probably usually the case. So it's philanthropic foundations. I do also just want to sort of piggyback on something that Scott has brought up a couple of times, which is that when you talk about the nonprofit organizations in particular, there are actually a lot of nonprofit environmental lawyers, but they do frequently pursue their own goals. So I do think that's something that we could use more of in the environmental legal world is nonprofit environmental attorneys who are doing the work for free and are foundation funded, but are taking their goals and taking their directions from the communities as opposed to setting those themselves and sort of, developing those internally.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I'll just add, I think grants and foundations, that's how our clinic is funded for the most part. But I'll also just mention for those that don't know, the reason why many law schools have a law school clinic is because it's required as part of legal education under the American Bar Association, some form of practice-based, skills-based learning for students. So law schools often will invest resources into clinics, which teach students and represent community clients. So I think that's why there are so many legal clinics doing pro bono work. It's part of our mission for the students as well as the communities. So
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, and I'll just touch on the funding's critical, and there's a lot of foundation money going out. I will point out one I think lapse in foundation work, and that, as I said before, I'm getting involved a lot in rural environmental justice issues, and it's such a critical, important issue. And if you look at there was a 2015 study by USDA that looked at foundation, and this is a huge issue, that looked at foundation funding in the United States, and found that over the 5-year period that preceded their 2015 study, only 6% of foundation money was being focused on rural communities. And so there's a real disparity when it comes to fund. Even so, that makes it, if you're a rural community facing environmental justice issues and funding is a hurdle, and most of our money's coming from foundations, imagine the hurdles you have to jump over to fund rural environmental justice issues. It's massive. So that needs to change.
Absolutely. I want to thank all of our panelists, Scott, Leah, Rachel, Seema. This has been a really great discussion. It has been recorded. We will share all of the recordings via YouTube in about a week, fingers crossed, hopefully, once we all get some sleep. We're now in our lunch break, 30-minute break. We'll start back up with sessions at 1 o'clock. This room will turn into the Park Equity Mapping Demonstration Room. And so thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the sessions. Take care.
Thank
Nice meeting
you.
you all. Thanks so much.
For having us. Good to meet you, Scott and Leah.
You too. Thanks, Rachel. Bye.
You too.
Bye, Lee.